Guys, this is now part of Unit 2. Unit 2 covers a section about refining the system. So as part of refining the system, we are going to look at the section on structuring the use case model. So we're going to go a bit back to the requirements because we've now looked at the requirements picture. We've looked at the analysis, but we can now go back to it. Okay. So from this, we are talking about the following, really just a matter of structuring the use case model, and structuring means the following. It says to us that we are going to factor out parts of our use cases to possibly make new use cases. Now, why would you do that? Okay, so it allows us to create more simpler use cases. In essence, what happens is you might have a use case with a lot of information in it. And if you start writing all of the specifications for your use cases, you might start to see that there's a bit of overlap. So that's why they say to us, better we get to simplify our original use cases, because we can then create a use cases just appropriate to the size to it. Okay, and then we can create new use cases for the things which overlaps, where we can possibly reuse it. So that brings us to this. It allows us to have some reuse of our requirements in the documentation so that we can then share that functionality between multiple use cases. If you go to an ATM, do you just print a slip once? From how many of those use cases can we possibly print the slip? What is a slip? That's a piece of paper that tells you that is what happened. When you withdraw money, if you transfer money, if you want to get your balance, if you have insufficient funds, it prints you that slip. So that's a place where we can do this, and we can reuse that specific requirement multiple times. So that means that we don't have to write the code many times. We can rather just call it many times from our program. So different ways in which this can be done. It can be done as either include and extend or generalization relationship. So include is indicated, or include and extend is indicated with these arrows, but where we've written on top of them include and extend. Generalization is the same as for other relationships where you still have a generalization relationship going on. So include relationship, they tell us about they say to us, it's a relationship from a base use case to an inclusion use case where we have our initial base use case, but this is now calling on some portion of logic which is being reused. Okay. So why is it called include? Because it means to us that we are going to explicitly call that specific logic section to include it in the base use case. Okay, what does it mean? Take for example, if you are now making a mistake on that transfer of funds, or even when you withdraw funds, and there is not enough funds, it doesn't really ask you, do you want to have a slip? It prints you a slip. Have you ever been in that situation where it just gives you a slip when you don't have enough money? Yeah. It has happened to all of us really, where you would like to withdraw more money than what's available in your account. And then what happens? It just gives you a slip back and saying to you, but we can't do this because there's insufficient funds. Okay, if that use case, if we structured our inclusion use case as the print use case, it is going to call it no matter what happens. Okay. Then they give us a bit of an example about how does it look inside your specification. From inside, if we have our base use case, we might go and say include the other use case. What does that mean? We are now saying at some point in my base use case, I'm including the logic which is provided by the other use case to us. Now, then there's just a bit about eggs trying to explain to us, if we have our base use case and we have our bit of logic, at some point it's just going to go out to the include use case, go through its logic, and then go back to the base use case. So there's a bit of mention about why do we use the include one to factor out behavior which is common to 2 or more use cases, and then to factor out and encapsulate behavior from our base use case and place it in another use case. Then there's also a mention about the extend relationship. What is the difference between the extend and the include? Extend is now getting to a place that is optional. So when we have something like this, we're going to insert an extension use case behavior into a base use case. So that means that we have a use case here, and this piece of logic is included and it's inserted into the base use case on some decision. Okay, so we insert it only if the extending condition is going to be true, and we insert into the base use case at some named extension point. So what does this mean? If we have 2 use cases, or a base use case called get quote, we can have get news and get expert predictions, but this will be included into our base use case. So in our get quote use case, we can go through it, and at some point there was a mention about extension points in the use case specification. From the use case specification, it then says to us, the optional services extension point occurs at step 3 in the basic flow and step alternative flow 1.7 in quote system unavailable alternative flow. So it mentions to us that at some point it's going to jump back to another use case when we reach this point. Okay. So here's the get news one. This use case extends the get quote use case at extension point optional services. So if we look in terms of these eggs, what does it mean? Earlier on, we had a piece of brokenness there where it at some point jumped out to the include use case, but now we have some condition there. If it reaches that condition, it jumps out. If we go back to the ATM, does it ask you, do you want to have a slip? Yes. Okay, so in some cases, if you want to have a slip printed, what does that mean? We can call on this piece of logic, this requirement sitting inside our extension use case, and only if you want to print a slip. Okay, then it would jump out to that piece of logic inside this use case. Otherwise, it would just continue with your base use case. Okay. There's again a mention about why do we use an extension use case. We factor out some optional or exceptional behavior, or to add some extending behavior based on conditional logic into your base use case. Okay. What does it mean? At some point, you might go and just design this use case, the initial use case. But then you would like to add behavior to this. And that behavior can be done as an extend use case, where we can add logic and stuff to it over time. Then there's also mentioned quickly about concrete and abstract use cases. You have done a bit of programming where you've talked about concrete classes and abstract classes. This is similar to that. What we are seeing that we have abstract use cases, and those are, for example, now A and D, which is our include and extend use cases. They cannot be initiated by itself. If you have an abstract class in programming, can you initiate it by itself? No. So if we look at our concrete classes, B and C, the base use cases, they can be initiated by themselves. We have our actor, which is communicating with the base use case, and from there we might go to our include use case. Again, on this side we have our base use case. If some condition occurs here and the guy has done it correctly and he would like to do this and it's true, then we're going to include, we're going to perform this extend use case also. So, also a question that we have to ask ourselves is why won't we structure use case model? Because sometimes it becomes over complex. Because we can functionally decompose our requirements in terms of the functionality. We can decrease the understandability of our initial use case diagram and make it more complex. Okay, so it increases the effort of your reviewer and the implementers and tester, because now they need to look at one use case, then it jumps to another one and possibly another one. And that may become overly complex. So also not all your stakeholders and people looking at the diagram may really be comfortable with the format situated in this. Okay, so also your use case model later on can start to look like a design. Okay. We can also get to actor generalization. You've done a bit about generalization, so you will know where does this fit in. Why would we use actor generalization?
In an instance where you are inheriting some functionality or that role of the particular parent is inherited by the child.
For instance, like you're saying, is that if we have a parent which is including a lot of the additional behavior, and it's performing a lot of the use cases for us, but then there may be situations where some of the children is doing unique things, and that is where they come into play. Take, for example, the doctor, the nurse, and the aide. All of these can be seen as medical workers. But these medical workers, not all of them can schedule an operation. Only the doctor can do that. But all of them can read a chart. Okay, so that was now just broken down in terms of skills, but it can be also done in terms of the functionality. What are you doing as a user in terms of your functionality when you're executing use cases? So there's also a bit about why do we use this actor generalization. Look at it. Then there's a mention about concrete and abstract actors. An abstract actor contains the common parts of the role. So that would be, for example, again, a medical worker. Now your concrete actors, they are, for example, the actual persons, or they can be initiated. They are the people who are doing this really for us. Okay. So there's also a bit about the guidelines on why would we do this, and how are we going to do this, and some notations to this. You can have a look at it. And there's also a bit about the structuring and why would we structure this. Okay. Now, a nice place to start is to create a small table, really, where we're saying this actor is communicating possibly, and is depending on, is he working with another actor? Well, this use case to this actors to almost develop a small matrix, we can say how are they working together to achieve something. There's also a bit about mention about some of the checkpoints when creating use cases and your use case diagram, which you can go through. There's a few review questions also at the end of this. Okay. Any questions on structuring the use case model? Okay, guys, so what is expected of you at this point? Is to almost look at your use case diagram and your use cases, and to possibly develop your use case diagram and take it through and extend it or include additional behavior. So how do we do this? How do we start to develop a structured use case diagram? It's going to take us back to this. Factoring out parts of use cases to create new use cases. Why would you do that? To make it easier to understand, to maintain, but also to share among many other use cases. So if you start to write the use case specifications, this is almost like a second or a third version of the use case diagram. Initially, you might have just created the use case diagram. You've done the activity diagrams, the use case specifications, all of that. But now you're starting to see that there is common behavior between some of the use cases. So you might even start to go back. That is where this comes in. And factor that behavior and adjust the scope of some of your use cases so that it's appropriate to the use case. Okay. For example, if we had done that use case on withdrawing funds at an ATM, and you start to write the specification, you could have said, when you withdraw money, it is going to send you an SMS, it's going to print a slip, all of that. And then when you do the use case specification for transferring funds between accounts, you're starting to see, but you select the account, you select the from account, you select the to account, you select the money. But then you start to see, but it also sends you an SMS and it prints a slip possibly. What are we seeing there? There's common behavior, which is being reused between use cases. So we can get to this factoring out behavior so that we can reuse it. Okay.
Can we factor out that use case using behavior inside? And saying, okay, this thing occurs once. Should I factor out something that occurs once?
So that's a good question. Should you factor out something which only occurs once? No, because it then gets to the place of creating a very complex diagram, and it can start to become very complex. Because then, when we're doing this, there was also mention about why should we not do this? Why wouldn't you structure this? Because it decreases the understandability, increases the complexity. Because you can then functionally decompose your requirements. It makes it a bit more complex if you're just taking one thing which only happens once and you place it in a use case. But if that thing by itself is so complex, then it is possible that you can structure it as a new use case. Okay.
So now, when factoring out the specific behaviors, so they, like, in this example, on all the transactions of the ATM, there can be an option of trading.
Yes.
So, but then for some cases, it's an optional, option. It's an optional option.
Okay.
So now, would it be advisable if ever it is optional only on 3% of the system and no, it's compulsory for 3% of the system and then the other 87% it's optional. So would it be advisable to still factor it out as a printing unique use case?
If you go to your diagram and you start developing the diagram, for some of them you might realize that you get to a place that when you have a withdrawal, it might be performed as an include. But for the other one, it might be done as an extend. So it doesn't mean that because we have a new factored out use case, it must always be an include. or for all of them it must be an extend. So if we go creating our diagram, it doesn't mean always that if we have the withdrawal use case and the transfer use case, it must always be working the same. So by saying that is, I mean, okay. So by saying that, the sending SMS in this case might have been an include use case. It is always going to be done. What does include mean? It will always happen.
So it's compulsory.
It's going to be compulsory. At some point in your base use case, it's almost like saying that this, we have our base use case still going down. We have that. But at some point, it now means to us that we are jumping out and then we're returning there. Because we've gone through the base use case, and then at some point it says to us, we'll include this new behavior. It goes through the include use case, and then it continues in the base use case. Okay. I heard the question about what is the difference between include and extend.
Yeah.
Okay, what is an extend now?
It's optional.
Yeah, now it's optional.
Okay. So if we have a use case called print slip, what does that mean to us? Is it always going to be done, or is it optional? So in some cases it can be considered optional. Okay. And that extends your functionality of your base use case. If the condition is then true in your transfer use case that you would like to do this, then you are going to do that. You follow, guys? Okay.
It's always included in the function. It always extends.
Yes. So the include use case is always going to be included in the base use case. It's almost like becoming part of it without really being part of it. The extend one, that's optional. It's like, if that happens, we will then add it. Okay.
Can this cause complexity to increase complexity and to exclude and include things like that all over the place?
Yes, that's why if we go back to this, it says to us that it decreases understandability and can increase the complexity. But if that is almost like if you've done this for the second or a third version of the system, it helps you to say, but how am I going to use my extends and includes? Because that initial use case is there. That system has been written, it's there.
That child there, how can it inherit
Yes.
the functionality from the parent, seeing this included?
Yes. So that is true, and a lot of times that you might have initial existing things sitting there, which after your first base iteration, you've gone through it, you've developed it, and then now you might start adding features to that. Okay. Any other
So
questions?
how do you restrict the child to not have those included
Okay,
while
remember,
inheriting from the parent?
remember, this is still just a matter of you structuring the use case diagram. Diagram is really just the requirements, but it also now has an output effect on your documentation. It's not a design yet. So when we get to the design and we start looking at that, we are now structuring our thinking in terms of this to include and to properly structure our use cases. So at some point, you might have your base use case, which might be an existing use case which is there, which you would now call or include another use case or call to some other thing in it. What I wanted to mention is due to the loops and the cycles you might have in the rational unified process or even agile assist, you might get to a place that you start off with your design. You go through it and you implement it. It's almost like your base first iteration. At some point you might get to it that you start to develop your functional, the use case which identifies the biggest piece of functionality. That might be included in iteration 1. But now, when you get to iteration 2, you start to see, but I can start to structure this possibly a bit differently. So you might have calls in iteration 2 from the base use case to other use cases. So in iteration 2 and later on, you might start to develop the include and extend use cases or some of the others. Okay. Any other questions, guys? Okay. Now, as a second portion to this week, there's a mention about designing prototype user interfaces. Okay, because it also plays a role in refining the system. When we now start looking at a specification, we start looking through that. What does it mean to prototype a user interface? Speak a bit louder.
A draft.
Okay, a draft. So, is this draft, this prototype, is it done inside a tool, inside an IDE?
Yeah. No, it's an environment dependent.
Okay, so it's a environment independent draft. So what does that mean? Is if we go here, we can just go to a nice whiteboard. This one is very smart, and I can go and say, but I have a user interface. If you had to do the user interface for the authenticate, where you go to an ATM and you insert your card, what is the things that you need to have on it? That's a display screen. So what is the first thing that you must have? When you go to an ATM, what do you see on the screen, guys?
Welcome message.
So the first screen might just be, let's firstly list all of these, and we just say, okay, we might have welcome. What else?
Some instructions. Prompts.
Prompts. This prompts will be for what? Your PIN. Okay, so what are we seeing? On our prompts, we might have the PIN, the account, the language. This might be things which we're prompting the person for. And in my bank, they first prompt you for your language. Once you've inserted and you've gone through the welcome screen, On the welcome screen, it displays the instructions. According to them, that's one. Your bank may do it differently. Then they may prompt you for the language which you would like to see this information in. Then it would display to you the account against which you can now be authenticated. And then you need to enter your PIN. Okay. So if we design this, we might just get to the process of saying, okay, first one being welcome. And instructions. Am I now going to draw it nicely and say this is where I'm going to place it already? No, because then it's really starting to get almost to a bit design. You can go and say, but if we do this, I would rather do this and have some general information to decide. And then you can go and say, okay, welcome. And instructions to this portion. What does that mean? So the information to the side may be things which the bank is working on, they're doing for the community, whatever. Promotions, yes. Because that's a very good place where they're starting to introduce people to new things the bank is doing at that ATM. Okay. Welcome and then instructions, because this you're always going to see. But we are not going to do it to that extent that you are going to proper do it in a tool, because it's going to take a lot more time. And the idea of this is to quickly do it, that you can possibly just show it to the client and say to them, this was what the screens which we see from this. And one of the problems that you might have is if you give this to them already done inside a tool, inside an IDE. What does it mean? It starts to give this person the perspective of this is how it's going to look. And then it can create a biased discussion, where this person might already feel to you, I don't like what you are portraying to me, or I like this, but I don't like it. Or later on, when you actually give them the system, it doesn't look like what you've expressed inside your initial drafts. This is really just a prototype to that. This can then be extended and by just adding some basic things to it. Any questions on this?
Can we link this to our use cases?
Yes. Which use cases?
Like the authentication use case. If it's
So inside the authenticate use case, where is this going to? So we might have our welcome screen. That was our first screen. If we go back here, as we said, welcome and instructions. So let's just write 1 and 2. So then we can go and create a new screen for the new things. What was the other first stuff that we're missing still? Is the prompts for the language. Is this done on the same screen? So how many different screens are we talking about for the prompt?
Doesn't it depend on how you want to design?
Okay.
Can
Can you include everything in one?
Yes.
The pin is supposed to be here to open something to let you use your account. So you cannot
Okay. So if we look at the system and we structure this and we try and place everything on one screen, you have gogos and grandparents, I have one. And you have people who's not very adamant in using electronic devices. or fluent in using them, would you structure this for them and placing it all on one screen?
You can fragment parts.
Hmm? What do you say?
On the audience.
Okay, so if the audience is for all South Africans to use,
And I'm not consider making it more friendly.
okay, so then you might consider making it a bit more user-friendly and structure this properly. That is really the main thing about this. So that we structure it in such extent that you can break it down into
Doesn't like
multiple.
encompass testing or something like that. Test cases like if it's for all South Africans, they do the same way or something.
Let me tell you, I was in Germany last year, and they don't have a language selection, which I could see very easily on that ATM. It was just a matter I went to the wrong bank. Yes.
So now, the concept of user interfaces, how does it link to the business goals?
Okay. So how does this link later on to the business rules and our design? In our initial design, how many classes did we identify? How many types of classes did we have? We had three types really. We talked about boundary, control, and entity. In design, is that always going to be free? Okay, so in design, when we're starting to design this for an ATM, an actual ATM, or even an online system, this might start to look different because the number of classes and the way in which you do this can be different.
But the language, which use case is for the language?
There is no use case really
So
for
we're
language.
just injecting something that doesn't exist.
No, we're not. Remember, this is not. This doesn't mean that if we prompt this person for PIN, that is a use case, and we prompt them for an account, that's a use case. All of this still really falls part of the authenticate use case.
Yes, I'm saying the language selection.
Yes.
Which use case does that belong to?
Remember, the language selection is almost like outside of this. It's like once you've made a selection of the actual language for the authenticate, are you going to still continue using that language
Use it once.
inside? Yes. If I select English as the language which I want to use for the communicating with the ATM, even if I go to view my balances later on, once I've been authenticated, it's still going to display English to me. It's not just going to switch it now to some other language. And if it does that,
Something that's just their own choice.
yeah, I might hit the
It might
cancel
be a
button.
good to the whole system. Yeah.
It can also be structured, like you're saying, as an include to the authenticate use case, but there's not enough. You're not performing this over and over.
Yeah.
This only really happens once. So this is an example to include and extend. We're not making language decisions many times. We're only doing it once. Yes. Only the effect of that decision is through us, throughout this whole interaction that's going to be there. Okay. So in terms of screens, we might have a screen for language, let's say 3.1. So we might have 3 screens here. So in essence, for this whole system, we are talking about 4 screens because this was done on 1 and this have been broken down into 3. So in terms of your actual design, you might now start to sit with 4 user interfaces. Okay. Yes.
So now, say, on this page of doing the user interface, does the selection of your, like your buttons, I'm gonna use
Your language play a role?
yes.
To one extent, no. Because what we have done here is we are really merely designing this user interface. We are now saying, if I am going to do the one for language,
Do we show buttons or boxes, everything
Okay.
that is in
remember your technology on what you're developing this for plays a bit of a role. Our buttons, what type of buttons do you have for an ATM? You just have an actual button to the side. It's not a touch screen. Okay, so by saying that, can I have a drop box? Or a tick box? Or a radio box for an ATM? Does it make sense?
It's a touch screen, yes.
If it's a touch screen, yes, but it's also a bit difficult to use. So that plays a role in the way in which you would design your user interface. Okay. But saying this, if this was a web-based system, so mainly saying that the type of technology which we're designing for plays a role. Okay. If this was a web-based system, could I have actual text boxes here? Yes. Can I have radio buttons and tick boxes? Yes. What would make the best selection for language? In South African context, it would probably be a drop-down box or radio buttons. Okay. But I actually think the radio buttons is going to take a lot of screen space because 11 official languages. Sure. So probably the best one would be a drop-down box. Okay.
So now it is a bit of importance in this.
But have we selected the language? Okay. So that's what I want you to see is that we've, in essence, really just realized, okay, this is how it will look if we are doing this for an actual ATM. So we can go and say, ATM, that's how it will look. But if we now had to do the same one for a web or mobile, it will look differently because the components that we might have is different. Okay.
I'm talking about screen level.
Yes, yeah, and screen space that you actually have. So if you are designing for a mobile device compared to web, your screen space differs quite a lot. You won't put the same amount of stuff which you would have for web, you can't put on mobile because there's just too little space. Okay. And it won't be very effective to zoom in and zoom out and those type of things. Yes. Yeah, but keep in mind that ITS on mobile is still a website you're viewing. It's not a mobile application you're using. Okay, because a mobile application is structured in such a way that it's appropriately visible. Okay. Any other questions, guys?
So now, can we display buttons?
Okay, can we display buttons?
This will happen, this will happen, this.
If I had to do the one for language, I would just do it like that. And you can then go and write a note to the side and say, language drop down. Language drop down. And that's what you say. Okay.
Interactions like where it takes you to another screen.
You can go and draw a navigation map where you might have blocks that says to you, you're going from this screen to that screen. That is mentioned in the presentation. We more touched now on how do you develop this. Okay. Get a question.
When we talk about ITS, so you have to create the application using the website. When I saw that today, we're still on apps. So they're creating that application for it.
Yes, take for example now, for ITS, what we're currently seeing is very, very web related. If a mobile application was developed, it would be a watered down effect, and they would probably reuse some of the functionality, but they can't really reuse the user interface that easily.
They can use their use cases, but interface-wise, it's
Yeah. What we've done, taken for example on Blackboard, is to say yes, it's a web system, but we've tried to incorporate our content and the structure in such a way that you can browse it
just code
on a
something
mobile
once,
phone.
It can be usable on your phone, and it can be usable on
Yes.
mobile. Hybrid.
Blackboard allows you to create HTML code for each of the items. And then you can tell this item to display based on a specific percentage size of the screen. So that is one of the things which we tried to do, that if you use it on a mobile device, it would structure your content and things around that. It doesn't mean that it's done everywhere
It's all about
properly.
Design.
Okay.
Design.
Yes. Guys, I hope that this was helpful and that you can do it from here on forward.